Quick introductions. David Kramer, to my left, is the president of Hudson Companies. He joined in 1995. I checked Hudson's website, it had 51 projects listed, but I'm told that is not the right number. The right number is...
I think 81.
81 projects. So, including one of my favorites, One Clinton, which is the 38-story luxury condo tower right above the brand new Brooklyn Heights Library. And Sam Charney, 2 seats to my left, has developed more than 1 million square feet of office as residential space when he was at Two Trees, and is now developing more than 2 million square feet at his own firm, Charney Companies, mostly in Long Island City, Williamsburg, and Gowanus. 2 seats to my left is Vicki Bean. She really needs no introduction. She is the queen of land use and housing policy in New York City. She's at the NYU Furman Center now. She used to be HPD commissioner, and she is the architect of mandatory inclusionary housing. And finally, last but not least, Jay Martin, the executive director of Community Housing Improvement Program. CHIP dates back to 1966. It represents 4,000 owners of rent-stabilized housing, and that represents 400,000 units of housing. He previously worked in the state senate, so he knows the strange land of Albany, which is largely what we're going to talk about here today as we try to digest the new landscape that Albany created for development in New York City. So let's start with that. Let's start with 485X, which is the replacement for 421A. It is the only way to build multifamily housing in New York City until the year 2034. So I would like to get your take from each of you on what do you make of this new 485X as a replacement for 421A? Let's start with you, David.
Well, I guess my mother taught me not to be too rude in public to others. So, I'll just say it's fine. It's better than nothing. I was talking to an assemblyman last week who said that legislation happens in Albany when the status quo is unacceptable and the solution is slightly better than doing nothing. And that's what I think 485X is. It's fine. It won't unshackle the needs of housing production that our city needs. And I think the biggest takeaway is that 200 years from now, when archaeologists and anthropologists are studying Brooklyn and Queens, they're going to say, boy, the number 149 must have been a very special, magical number. It must have had great feng shui to New York City in the early 21st century because all of their buildings were 149 units, which is, I think, what's going to happen, certainly on the Brooklyn Queens waterfront, as well as probably throughout most of the rest of the city.
And you're referring to the wage differential when you build 149 versus 150. There's also a cutoff at 99, is there not? So maybe we see a bunch of 99 unit buildings. I mean, is this a case of the tail wagging the dog in terms of, Albany deciding what the market should do and sort of not the other way around?
I mean, this is absolutely, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So they had to get the trades involved. They had to, meet the needs of the progressive left. And what you have is a mishmash of priorities. For example, one of the wage requirements is that developers have to pay the lesser of 60 or 65% of prevailing wage, or a specific wage amount, $65 or $70 per hour for each trade. So already we now have a new profession which is trying to calculate these payments for literally every type of worker in every different union. And it's an enormous administrative task to even undertake it, let alone trying to figure out if there's a gotcha involved.
So I should have told my kids to go into accounting for the construction industries was basically what...
This will be a new industry. And the reason it doesn't make any sense is that the prevailing wage element, I assume, was intended to get the construction trades to back the deal. But all it's going to mean if you're paying 60 to 65% of prevailing wage is that you're not necessarily building at a prevailing wage union rate if you're paying 60 to 65%. So it didn't end up, I think, winning them anything in terms of new business, which didn't make any sense to begin with, because it's not as though the union trades are building these residential buildings, in the current multifamily industry.
Vicki Bean, is this going to work or not?
Time will tell, unfortunately. There's a lot of unknowns. The labor, how much the labor deal really adds to the costs is a major unknown, and I think quite worrisome. The notion that the market is different, 0 to 99, 100 to 149, and above 149 is not very plausible, right? For the reasons that you all have discussed, people can game the system by only building to 149. We at the Furman Center recommended just look at what the local market rents are. That's what will determine whether or not the building pencils or not what size it is, but the local market rents. But that's complicated and was too complicated, I think, for the legislature to wrap its head around. But the other thing that really worries me about, one thing I think is very positive, and that is that it's for 10 years. Doing this every 4 years is ridiculous, and developers can't plan. You get all of these grandfathering issues, et cetera. So I'm glad to see that it's 10 years. The thing that I'm worried about is the affordable units are really targeted at a level that is quite high, right?
Is quite low.
Pardon?
The low income you're talking.
The low income units are targeted quite high. So they're targeted, if you're above 150 or above, you have to build at 60% AMI. That's a normal, sort of amount that we focus low-income housing on. But everything else is at 80% AMI, which is $112,000 a year for a family of 3. So that number is given by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, and has gone up by 80% since the last 421A was passed. So what was passed in 2015 and 2016, requiring affordability at 80% AMI, that 80% AMI in 2015 is now like 110% AMI today, right?
Okay, now I understand politicians have to keep social policy in mind, but that doesn't mean anything to a lender.
No.
Sam, when you go to a lender or to investors and say, I want to do this project, they're not asking you, well, is it going to serve the affordable housing needs of New York City? They're asking you, will it pencil out? Does this pencil out for your projects in your neighborhoods?
So we're still looking into 485X and understanding, will it pencil and will it work? Most of our projects are getting built under the 421A extension, right? So we're ecstatic about that happening, and I think the governor did a great job pushing that through. 485X, I think the verdict's out. We got to figure out, we're talking to our contractors, we're trying to understand what prevailing wage really does to the costs of our project and ultimately how they get financed. I think the devil is in the details with this stuff. There's a lot of flaws. It's interesting that there's a for sale component, which we never had, which in talking to a lot of council members and a lot of assembly members over the past year or two, they all said, we want to see an affordable for sale component. But it's based on an assessed value of $89 per foot. And the assessment doesn't happen until I get a TCO. So how do I know if I'm going to qualify for an affordable for sale project if the assessment's not happening until I've completed the building? And how am I selling to the end user then when I'm putting on my condo offering plan and it's, are my taxes abated or are they paying full taxes? And ultimately then it's at the discretion of the Department of Finance. So I think really what has to happen now, to David's point, we're creating more jobs. Like DOF is now going to have to vet and pre-approve projects and say, your assessed value is X or Y, and you can qualify for sale or you can't qualify. And the other interesting thing, which is still not clarified, is the for sale abatement available to a partial building, or is it only for the entire building? Because, my lower floor units and my units without views and whatnot may dip under $89 a foot, whereas my penthouse units are going to be more. So I really think that we are trying to explain this over the past couple of years. We built a model internally at Charney Companies that we were giving to any senator and assembly member and governor who wanted to see it. We effectively called it 421A for Dummies, right? Was the if you ever picked up like the Driving for Dummies book or whatever that series was, this was the same thing. It had like 5 different toggles, and it was, you want prevailing wage, turn the toggle on. You want lower affordability, turn it this way. And so there were 5 variables. Ultimately, you had to solve for a 7 yield on cost. And we said to all of them, do whatever the hell you want, but ultimately you need to solve for 7 yield on cost. And if you're not solving for it, the capital is going to leave New York and it's going to go elsewhere. So you can't have a building with prevailing wage, ultra low affordability, a high percentage of affordability, and by the way, I want to keep the character of the neighborhood the same and keep the FAR low. So there, ultimately we ended up with this. I don't know if it's good. I don't know if it's bad. We're evaluating it all. I will say the last point on it that I really don't like is the $40 minimum wage, because what that does is only penalizes the poorest people on the job site. Because what's going to happen is the guys who are making $25, $30 an hour, who are pushing mini containers around and sweeping and doing the carting and debris, they're not employable anymore. So what happens is we'll pick a skilled laborer over the unskilled labor every day of the week. And those guys, they'll have carpentry skills, they'll have minor electrical or plumbing skills, they'll get jobs. And the local laborers who are unskilled, who really need the work the most, are going to find themselves out of jobs.
Jay, that's amazing to me, though, you described there, because, well, first of all, just on the condo element, they have potentially put together a condo component that will not work because it depends on an assessed value that you won't know when you're raising money or penciling out a project. So that may be unworkable. Similar to the last 421A, when there was a condo component in there and not a single person used it because it was unworkable. So Jay, I want you, since you have Albany experience, I want you to tell me how this kind of thing can happen. Well, is it that the legislators did not understand it? Or did they, for instance, the $25 an hour worker no longer being employable on a construction site?
It's a perfect, the housing deal in general and these proposals that came out are a perfect example of how Albany solves problems with more problems. Instead of stripping down at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is a property tax problem. Rent-stabilized properties are not penciling out at the end of the day because we have a huge property tax burden that's not subsidized. New builds, 421A, the genesis of 485X at the end of the day, was for a property tax exemption, which is now turned into a union job employment program. And at the end of the day, when Albany tries to solve for other problems, when they're trying to really get at solving for property taxes, which is something that will require the city and state to work together on, which brings in a whole other host of political problems, you get policies like this. And it's why we are doomed to not solve our fundamental housing problems until we have leadership and leaders who are willing to strip down the problems and solve the root cause, which in this case is property taxes.
Do you think that the legislature thought, well, if we just make it $40 an hour, then all those people who were making 25 will now make 40?
I'm sorry, I didn't...
Do you think that the legislators thought if we just make it $40 an hour, everyone who used to make 25 will now make 40?
Yeah, I don't even think it went that far. I think it went... We have constituencies, we have unions that we have to work with, and they are a very powerful constituency. We are getting tremendous pressure to build housing, and they are telling us they need to make 40. So that's our ask at the table, negotiating table. I think it's just that simple. I don't even think it was Machiavellian. It's, give me a number, 40? Okay, that's the number. 40 is what I need.
Yeah, it seems to me like they just took the wage. There was an impasse between REBNY and PCTC, the Construction Trades Umbrella Group, on wages, and the legislature just sort of threw a dart at the board and came up with a number in the middle and said, well, just work with that. And it seems to me like you can do some work with that, but you can't do all work. Like, Vicki, what neighborhoods will this work in, and what neighborhoods will it not work in?
So it may work in Manhattan south of 96th Street, south of 110th Street. It may work on parts of the Williamsburg Greenpoint coast, but not other parts. So we'll see. But I want to go back to something that David said as well. It is an enforcement nightmare. When I was commissioner of HPD, the amount of time and energy and resources that went into checking prevailing wage, and now you have a situation where every worker has to be thinking about, am I getting 65% of prevailing wage and prevailing wage changes all the time? So, what you do on day 1 is not necessarily the amount that you should be making on day 50 when the rates change. So it's an administrative nightmare that will result in a lot of litigation and a lot of headlines that nobody wants to deal with, right? And so I think that's a real issue.
I can answer your question by saying that with the last Affordable New York iteration, and where construction costs were and interest rates, we could do projects where the project penciled with rents in the mid-30s. That's going back, let's say, 10 years. But rents in the mid-30s over the course of a year is $3 a month, let's say, which means that a 650 square foot one bedroom, if it was renting for $19.50, we thought that in certain transitional neighborhoods in the outer boroughs, that could be a successful project. And what's happened over the last 10 years is that with 45X having lower AMIs, and now these wage issues, as well as interest rates and construction cost inflation, our break-even numbers are closer to the rents in the 60s and 70s, which means, to answer your question, the neighborhoods that can accommodate new housing are going to be neighborhoods that can accommodate rents in the 60s and 70s, which is not necessarily where you want to see all the new housing being built.
Now, is that a conversation that you can actually have with legislators, and they will understand it? I mean, Jay, you've been having conversations about rent-stabilized housing for the last 4 or 5 years. How much of what you say actually is really digested in any meaningful way?
So the average lawmaker gets 1,000 issues thrown at them on a daily basis, and they don't have the ability to really become an expert in any one issue. So the way the legislature works is they default to the chairs, housing chair, and leadership. So more often than not, I don't blame them for not knowing the minutia of funding and property taxes and how that interacts with lending, but I blame them if they're not willing to listen. And what we've learned is that the more they listen, the more they understand. So like in parts of the Bronx, we've had some success in doing tours of rent-stabilized properties, showing them the nuts and bolts of renovating a unit of housing, how much that actually costs. When they're able to see it with their own 2 eyes and experience the real cost of operating this housing, then we see movement. They come to understand where we're coming from. But lawmakers that refuse to go on tours, they refuse to sit down with property owners, they've just kind of designated us as the enemy, for lack of a better word. They're a huge hindrance to solving real problems. And there are enough of those still where I don't think we're going to get over that hump in the near future.
Well, if you guys are the enemy, then who's going to build the housing that solves the supply crisis? I mean, is there still a large contingent of the legislature that feels that you are not the answer to the supply, that government can actually build the supply? Because I see a lot of that on Twitter. let's just forget those guys. Too much profit involved. That's why rents are so high. Let's just have nonprofits do all the housing. I mean, Sam, you've been doing this. Actually, collectively, I think you guys have about 150 years of experience in New York, which is quite amazing. To what extent have we evolved, or maybe devolved, to where we are now, where there's an understanding of what to do? You put it out, the thing for dummies, you put it out in black and white. And Jed Valenta said here, this is actually not that complicated math. It's 7th grade math.
It's really simple. I mean, Jed's right. Like, I used to work with him, right? The highest level of math we ever used was algebra. So it's really quite simple. I mean, I think to Jay's point, they are getting a ton of stuff thrown at them consistently, so they shouldn't be experts on housing. But to be able to listen and understand and say, this is what the private sector is telling you, and we can't build unless you're giving us X, Y, and Z, and then they just take it and do something else with it, is just counterintuitive, makes no sense, right? The built world today, building a building, is probably the only industry that is worse than it was 100 years ago. Like, we actually build slower. The quality of the product is worse. It's truly incredible that we have not innovated and figured this out at this point. And I think that there's a lot of belief that the developer is this fat cat monopoly man, with his top hat and monocle running around making tons of money. I think that a ton of the assembly members and senators we spoke with actually did not grasp the concept that we are getting capital from other places, that we're like merchant builders, that we're not multi-generational, landowners like the Rockefellers. And so when we tell them that, the Blackstones of the world and the Goldman Sachs and whoever else we're doing business with need to get this kind of return on their capital, they need to get these kinds of IRRs, or the banks need to get this kind of debt yield, they're surprised. And that to me is mind-blowing, that, they don't grasp the concept that the money needs a certain amount of yield. It's the money's being managed, by these firms, and the money's coming from elsewhere, and the money is very quickly going to flow elsewhere if we can't deliver the kind of returns in New York that we need to deliver.
I want to get into a little bit of the other reason housing is so expensive, and that is because of the amount of red tape, bureaucracy that you have to deal with. Vicki, not to put you on the spot, you did run HPD. I hear a fair number of complaints from developers and other folks that HPD and Department of Buildings, et cetera, are just fire department taking too long to do everything. Is that a legitimate complaint, or is it just a matter of
all Vicki's fault?
Hard-working staff doing the best they can?
It is a legitimate complaint. Absolutely, it's a legitimate complaint. And it goes back to something that I think really Jay was saying, is you're trying to solve a whole bunch of problems and you lose sight of the fact that when you tweak in this way to give somebody a little more due process or somebody a little more protection, then the costs and the time go up, and that ends up hurting the very people that you're trying to help, right? So a good example is when we bring units online, when we bring housing online, it takes forever to actually get people into those units, and that's silly for them to be sitting empty. It's silly it's so many levels. But you want to protect the person who got the notice that they had won the lottery and had a high lottery number and that they should come in, but they say that they didn't get the notice. So you give due process, you give a right to appeal. All of those things add up. They're perfectly well-intentioned, but you can only add so much onto the basic set of problems, as Jay was saying.
One developer told me that in her 421A buildings and the affordable units, it takes her 6 to 8 months to fill a unit, an affordable unit, because of the bureaucracy involved. And I mentioned that to another developer, and he's like, I need to get her on board, because 6 to 8 months sounds fabulous to me. It takes me a year. Like, so how could that be?
Well, so I mean, we completely revamped the Housing Connect, the lottery system, when I was at HPD. But you're working against layer upon layer upon layer of requirements, right? The federal requirements. If there are tax credits in it, you have to make sure that you absolutely do not have a tenant in there who doesn't qualify. You have city council requirements. You have state requirements. You have just layer upon layer of requirements that make it impossible, and people are risk averse, right? You don't want to be sued, you don't want the headline risk, and so there's a lot of risk averseness and a lot of just layering goal after goal after goal, and not recognizing that in the end you're hurting all of the goals.
You know, I think rental vouchers are a good example of that, a well-intentioned program that is not executed especially well. Jay, you have extensive experience in this. You have 4,000 members who deal with rental vouchers. Like, you're a big proponent of rental vouchers, but what is the issue exactly?
I think Rebney and Wynn, Christine Quinn's group, just came out with a report last week. It was much of the same territory we've covered before. The paperwork takes forever to be processed. They're shorthanded, to their credit. They really don't have a lot of caseworkers to handle all the applications that are going through. And you know, by the way, nobody wants to spend more money on government to fix the problem, but it is necessary to make it more efficient. You could cut more, and then, you know, it's the cart before the horse. You get less efficient government when you cut more at the same time. So you get trapped into the system where you have thousands of people applying for vouchers. You have people sitting in shelters. You have property owners who want vouchers. There are parts of the city right now where there are more voucher holders being placed in apartments than cash residents. And I'm sure that's not surprising to many of the people in the audience, or certainly not to my members. But it takes 4 to 6 months to get the placement. Then after the inspection, you can fail in an inspection for something as simple as a crack on an electrical outlet. Like absurd things, well, you can fail an inspection for.
Is that true? I mean, I think everyone here at some point has put a plastic cover on an electrical outlet, turned that screw a little too tight, and the thing cracks.
Yep.
But you can fail a voucher inspection for that?
It happened last week to a member of mine who I spoke to. I mean, it happens. And at the same time, we're talking about spending billions of dollars to develop new shelter systems, and when we can be effectively getting more people out of the shelter, and with vouchers, and to the 485X, 421A conversation, this could be a solution, actually paying for the cost of housing. I mean, it's something you've heard me repeat ad nauseum. Paying for the cost of housing is a solution to the problem of development. It's a solution to the problem of rent stabilization. Well, the government is asking for private developers, rent-stabilized property owners to keep providing housing, and they're making demands. Fair, but they're not willing to meet us in the middle with the cost. So they're coming up with all these ancillary systems to figure out ways to abstract more costs. But a voucher actually makes the government ante up the cost and meet us in the middle. We wouldn't need an entire 485X system if you said, okay, this new development, you have to accept 30% of the building is now vouchers. And the government pays for that. And now you can afford to pay for a new development. You wouldn't have to worry about making sure that all these different nuances are into it, because you know on the voucher side, you're approving who can qualify for the affordability on the voucher side. I mean, we all have the solutions on this panel. I'm sure if all the four of us and you, Eric, were running this, we could fix it. But it's the math that's not being talked about is the political maths. The math that says for every property owner that comes to me and complains, there are 30 renters that come to me and say, I can't afford my rent. And there are, for every Jed Walentis that stands up here and says it's ridiculous that I can't build, there are thousands of renters who say, every time a new building goes up, I can't afford to live in my neighborhood anymore. And as long as that dynamic exists, and that math exists, politicians, lawmakers will be inclined to accept that renters need to be answered for more immediately than the long-term solutions that are necessary.
You know, I think we've actually got a little beyond the narrative that development raises rents. I think more politicians now are accepting that we do need housing supply. That's what this whole debate was about. That's why they didn't want to leave Albany without some kind of deal on supply. but there are still so many other issues. I was wondering, like, if you had, I don't know, 15 minutes with the mayor to sit and like list 1 or 2 or 3 things that you would like him to know that you don't think he knows about the housing problem, what would you tell him, David?
Well, first of all, it's true, Jay. Nobody wants to hear real estate people complain, except for the Real Deal Forum here, where we have a good audience. First of all, the mayor's City of Yes is a really wonderful, thoughtful, comprehensive package that we'll see if it gets through the city council. But in the way it waives parking requirements, adds density for affordable housing, is quite thoughtful, and that is one step. But I think that a mayoral task force would look at what are all of the areas of inefficiency, and we can go up here and talk about every agency and how they torture us. And everything is there because there was some problem once. There was a crisis, or there was a scandal, and now we have X. I mean, the most recent example that we have suffered through is that because of 9/11, which happened to the World Trade Centers, the fire department for certain size buildings has an ARCS system, which stands for Auxiliary Radio Communication System, so that if firefighters are in a building, say the World Trade Center, and they need to communicate, they need to have this ARC system. Well, now this ARC system is literally in every New York City building over a certain size. And when you put it in and you ask the fire department for a inspection so that you can approve the ARC system, they may take up to a year or 2 years to even do the inspection on the ARC system, and you can't get your final CO without an ARCS sign-off. So that's a perfect example of something where, like, nobody wants to go to the city council or the state legislature and say, we don't need ARCs after 9/11. Like that, there's no political benefit to so many of the different reforms, that would make housing more affordable, that would make the supply easier to build. I was listening to a panel this morning, not here, but at the Center for Urban Future, and one of the panelists said, would it be okay if in a 3-bedroom apartment, one of the bedrooms didn't have a window? Which actually I remember the mayor mentioning once, talking aloud a couple of years ago. Now, is any city council person or state legislature going to say, this is the legislation I really want to champion, that we're going to take away light and air from residents? But there are all sorts of things you could do to make the housing supply easier and more affordable to build. Another perfect example is we haven't really changed our building codes after requiring sprinklering. So I first started developing in New York in 1995. The first building I developed didn't have sprinklers in an 8-story building. I think sprinklers were required starting in, let's say, 97, 98. And so if you have sprinklers in multifamily, you might be able to accommodate some sort of type 5 building construction, which is what the rest of the world refers to as stick building, which you see in Westchester all over the place, which is, wood frame over a concrete podium. The reason New York City doesn't allow that is because they don't want the Chicago fire of the 19th century. But with sprinklering, you could easily have other construction types to make housing more affordable and to be able to increase the housing supply. But I just don't see a world where that's something that legislators want to champion.
Yeah, for instance, we can't have a unit smaller than 400 square feet because that would be unfair to the people who are living in them. Meanwhile, Corey Johnson, who is the Speaker of the City Council, has been living for years in a 316 square foot apartment in the Village, which he's very happy with. Sam, you have a lot of experience building smaller units, but you still can't build them as small as maybe you want to.
Yeah, so it's a great point. So they got rid of the minimum dwelling unit size, right? That no longer exists. However, you still have the average dwelling unit size, 680 square feet. So your development has to accommodate for 680 square feet across the board as an average. Means you could build a ton of small studios if you wanted, but you'd be leaving a bunch of FAR on the table because your amount of units that you can build as dictated by the FAR will max out at 50, 100, whatever it is. So ultimately, you're trying to put this puzzle together and solve for what's the most efficient unit size for each unit type, for a studio, for one, and for a two, that I could fit into the building, and some threes. We did a project in Long Island City called the Greenhouse. It's a mad scientist project. It is 50 units, and we said, if we're beholden to the 680 square foot average dwelling unit size, why not make most of our units 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartments? And max bedroom count, because we can put more people in that building, and more people will pay more money. So we said, okay, we're going to run the gamut. I think they're 600 to 700 square feet. They're 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartments, and the absolute rent is cheaper than all of our competitors in the market. Long Island City, we're, $4,750 to $5,500 for 2-bed, 2-bath apartments. Those are $6,500 at our competitors. They're smaller units, they're more efficient, but they have great finishes, and we're doing $90+ a foot on the gross when our competitors are doing 70, 75. So to me, that's the way to solve for housing. Like, get rid of the average. And I think I agree with David. City of Yes is very thoughtful and has put forward a lot of this really intelligent thinking about how do we build more units with the constraints that we have. But absolutely, like, look, we did this under the Bloomberg administration. We were talking about microhousing, and then all of a sudden it went away. And we just said, all right, we're not building in small units anymore. We did like 2 projects to test it and try it, and then it just fell flat after that. So to me, increased density, allow for as many units as possible on a site, and you'll solve a lot of the housing issues quick.
I'm sure you've all had the experience where you need a rezoning and the city council member says, okay, I'll let you build this, but we need more units for families. So you have to turn a lot of your studios and 1-bedrooms into 2 and 3 bedrooms. And then, of course, 4 guys who are 24 years old come in and they share the rent. And that's not a nuclear family, but you know what? They're bringing more money to the table, so that's who gets the apartment. There are probably lots of examples of things like that. I want to switch quickly to good cause eviction and ask how does it affect what you guys will be doing over the next 10 years?
I actually think they got that one right. I have no quibbles with it. I mean, certainly there's plenty of buildings where if the units are 30% below market, you'll make it up in 3 or 4 years. An 8.5% increase, I feel, is like, perfectly reasonable for 98% of us. And I think that if I could sprinkle a little optimism on these conversations, one good thing from what just happened is that now we have good cause and 421A in our rearview mirror, and maybe we can get some actual other things done, because that was a logjam now for years. And one other thing that the legislature did in 2019 is that they increased the threshold for a condo conversion of a rental building from 15% to 51%, and the 51% have to all be existing tenants. And since 2019, there have been 0 condo conversions, 0. So I spoke to an assemblyman a few weeks ago, and I said, hey, has the legislature looked at the fact that they changed the law and they've fallen on their face, and it's a terrible idea, and there's no activity, so maybe we should have the equilibrium swing back a little bit? And the assemblyman said, oh, that'll never happen. The politics could never allow that to happen. And so maybe with good cause and this other stuff behind us, we can solve for some of these other issues, like the fact that there hasn't been a condo conversion. Because from the progressive left's standpoint, a condo conversion is a chance for wealth appreciation for tenants. It's a really an incredible opportunity. Actually, my family benefited from it in the mid 80s with all the co-op conversions that happened.
I'm shaking my head, David, because they just don't see it that way. They changed the number from 15% to 51% for the express reason of preventing co-op conversions, because they didn't want renters to have to be kicked out, and they didn't think they would qualify for a mortgage anyway. So I think that was by design. That's why I don't think that's going to change. Jay, I wondered on good cause, admittedly, the real estate did very well on the percentage rent increases, but it does fundamentally change that you have a permanent right to renew your lease as long as you are current on your rent. And doesn't that change sort of the fundamentals of being a landlord?
Of course. I do appreciate David's positive view. I just want to acknowledge that. I appreciate you looking at the 51% threshold and figuring out a way to look at that positively. I think there's more of that needed in this industry. Actually, we do need to focus on fixing that. I think it's going to require a lawsuit to fix that, frankly. And I'm aware of challenges that are being percolated or being put together for that specific component of HSTPA, because it's ridiculous. It's really clearly an overstep by the legislature within that law. As far as good cause, we took a position very on as an organization. The average rent stabilized lease renewal is less than 5% on average. We took a survey of our members. We realized where the numbers were on good cause. We took a very political position that we didn't have the political capital to fight good cause and also ask for the changes we need on vacancy. So we let kind of the rest of the industry fight against good cause, and we focused on the changes in rent stabilization. The problem with good cause now isn't what it looks like now. It's the fact that California will have a ballot measure to repeal Costa-Hawkins, which is essentially removing vacancy decontrol. And that, to your point earlier, the camel's nose in the tent. There is nothing stopping the legislature now that they have the ability and they've kind of crossed the political hurdle. I look at it the other way. They've already accomplished the hardest part. They've passed it. Now it's easier to tweak it. It's easier to go back in and say, this 5+ CPI is too high this year. We're hearing from a lot of renters that it's too much. We've got to lower it. Let's get support to pass an amendment to make it lower. That, I think, is the primary concern of most property owners, and I think that's the biggest threat going forward.
We have time, I think, for one more question. I'm going to ask each of you to tell me what you think outside of government, what do you think the private sector could be doing? Each of your organizations could be doing better. In other words, for David and Sam, what developers could do better? For Vicki, what think tanks like the Furman Center could do to improve this whole situation? Jay Martin, what your owners could do? I know you have a particularly challenging membership because there's nothing like a rent-stabilized building owner or 4,000 of them, getting them to move in the same direction. But what if you could each give us a message that you would like your community to do better? You guys are perfect already? You have nothing?
Let's go.
Go ahead.
Right. At the end of the day, this is a political conversation. And I think what keeps getting lost is that there's a perception that everyone is socialists because they don't agree with us. And I think, certainly there's a minority population of lawmakers that are socialists. And you and I have had this debate before. You are on Twitter and social media, so you see this. They're not. A majority of the legislature is a pendulum, and it will go where it thinks the power is. And what's happening in some of these districts is only 8% of people are voting. And so when you represent 30 to 40% of the electorate that's voting in 8%, like the DSA is doing in some of these districts, it feels to the majority of the legislature that the power is with them. But that means also that it isn't as big as it seems. And so it's very close to switching back. So I would just say that we're actually closer to a pendulum shifting than it seems, even though it's very bleak right now. But it does require involvement with elected officials, voting, engaging with the constituencies of brokers and the ancillary environment in and around real estate, and getting people to vote, because even though it seems as if you're outnumbered 2-1, it's much closer to a 50-50 constituency.
Yeah, it's amazing how there are 213 state legislatures. There are 8 socialists, and somehow the other 205 think that their seats are threatened by the fact that 8 socialists managed to win seats. And the whole thing conversation shifted for like 10 years now, and it's only finally beginning to shift back. Vicki, what can Furman Center do?
So I think the one thing that's really important is to start holding the legislature accountable when things don't work. And it isn't enough to pass a bill, right? It has to be a bill that actually accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish. And there are so many that don't by design. I'll give one example in good cause, right? You have an exemption for people with a portfolio of 10 or fewer units. It's impossible for the average person or for legal aid or anybody else to figure out what the portfolio of a person is. There are different LLCs, there are different family members, and everybody understood that it was impossible. So why do we have that, right? Why did we pass that only to cause a lot of confusion about what was actually going on? So I think holding people accountable for those kinds of things, for the kinds of things that David was talking about, where, okay, you said you were going to fix this, you did Y, and it's not working at all, so why aren't you changing, right? I think that's really important, because otherwise just passing something becomes the goal rather than passing something that actually works.
Well, I gave up eating desserts in September, so I'm all out. I'm doing the best I can. That's as good as it gets. I would add that, one thing we haven't talked about is it's not exactly multifamily, it's not exactly development, but the court system is completely broken. It takes 2 years to evict a tenant for non-payment, and it's even harder to evict a tenant for non-monetary issues. And these are the ones that can have such a corrosive impact on a building. If you have tenants who are literally beating up their neighbors, threatening the super, which is happening in our buildings, setting their apartment on fire, it can take even longer to remove somebody. So I was talking to an assembly person about it, and his ears perked up because he's like, oh, this is not just like money-grubbing landlords trying to evict tenants. This is about like building community and getting rid of tenants that the whole building needs to see you get rid of for the betterment of the building. And all of a sudden I thought like, oh, maybe this is like, this could be an effort to try and figure out how to way to like expedite the worst of the worst tenants who are making the lives of their neighbors miserable, and it takes 2.5 years to evict them.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Sam, but I do, just picking up on that, I think the real estate industry has not done a good job of portraying some of these necessary changes as advantageous to everyone, like in the example, and once in a while it gets it right. There was a bill a couple of years ago to ban criminal background checks of prospective tenants. The real estate lobby got tenants to come out and testify that, no, we don't want criminals living in our building, and that was the only reason the city council rejected the bill. So for me, the messaging has to improve, has to be more like that. Sam?
Yeah, I think we need to do a better job with architecture and design in our city. I think that we have a lot of developers who start a project and say, give me a EFIS building, stucco on the outside, some piece of crap because they know that that's what they can build, or give me the same window wall glass facade building because I know that I can build that. We try to start with like giving the architect as much freedom as possible and saying, go shoot for the stars. And, we build ourselves, so we're managing the subs ourselves, and we're pricing stuff as we go. And if we think we can do it, then we do it. But we want to make a lasting imprint in New York City on everyone's urban experience. And I think it's really important. These things are going to be around for 100, 200 years, that, from the inside out, these buildings really make a positive example for everybody who's living in New York. So better design for sure.
Well, I want to thank all 4 of our panelists. I think it's been incredibly insightful. And I have to say, I deal with folks like you all the time, and I don't get the impression that you are evil fat cats trying to evict people and get money wherever you can. I do sense that there is a great amount of sort of civic motivation to improve things, and I don't think that, for whatever reason, that message has resonated, but perhaps that's something for next year that we can talk about on this panel. Thank you very much for joining us today.